Welcome to Module 2 in the Python course. Throughout this portion of the course, we will build upon the foundational knowledge of Python programming that you have already acquired and take your skills to the next level. This module is designed for those who have already completed the basic Python concepts such as data types, variables, loops, functions, and other topics covered in the previous module. As we progress, we will dive deeper into intermediate topics including object-oriented programming, error handling, file handling, SQL databases, and more. You will learn how to create and handle exceptions effectively, read and write files, work with external libraries, and perform advanced data manipulation tasks using Python programming. In addition to theoretical concepts, this module will focus primarily on practical implementation. You will work on hands-on coding exercises and projects that will help you reinforce your learning and develop real-world Python programming skills. By the end of this module, you will be able to confidently write intermediate-level Python code, understand more complex Python programs, and be ready to take on more advanced projects. Whether you want to enhance your Python skills for your career, personal projects, or for further studies, the intermediate content covered in the upcoming lessons is the perfect next step in your Python learning journey. So let's dive in and unlock the full potential of Python programming. Hi everyone, welcome back to yet another lesson in Python programming. Today's lesson marks the beginning of Module 2. In our previous module, we focused on some of the basics in Python programming. Now, the topic of discussion for today's lesson is working with Python Lambda functions. With that said, let's have a look at the objectives for today's lesson. First, we'll kick off today's lesson by defining and understanding Lambda functions in Python programming. And then next, we'll move on to an actual practical demonstration where we'll learn how to use Lambda functions. Let's get started. And the first question that comes to mind here is, what exactly are Lambda functions in Python programming? Well, simply put, Lambda functions in Python are anonymous functions that can be defined without a name. They are also known as inline functions or function literals. Lambda functions are defined using the keyword lambda, followed by the function parameters and then the function body. Now, in terms of its usefulness, lambda functions can be useful in situations where you need to define a small function very quickly on the fly without having to define a formal function using the define or the def keyword. Some important characteristics of lambda functions include the following. They are defined with the lambda keyword, as we just mentioned. They accept multiple parameters and return a single expression. Now, the syntax in terms of a lambda function looks something very similar to this. First, we specify the lambda keyword. We then provide any arguments we'd like to pass through our lambda function, and we return some sort of expression. So, enough of all the theoretical based concepts. Let's actually take a moment to dive into a practical demonstration to see the behavior of lambda functions in Python programming. Now, before starting with this practical demonstration, we first have to create a new project. And if you recall from our previous module, the development environment of our choice was PyCharm. So after booting up PyCharm, simply create a new project and save this project to a specific location. In my case, I'm going to save it to Python source code -live. I'm also going to provide this with a name. So I'll say lesson 1 over here. And make sure that your interpreter environment has been chosen as well. I'll then click on create and I'll simply click on create a new window. This will load the default template up as we are already familiar with. I'm simply going to remove all the boilerplate code, close down this notification. And once again, if you need a refresher on how PyCharm works or how to install PyCharm, do check out the module 1 course content. Also, to create a new project, simply navigate to file and click on new project over here. So just to make sure that we can actually see the code over here, I'm going to zoom in as well. And then I'll click on view. Simply navigate to increase font size in all editors, or on a Windows machine, you can simply hold down Alt, Shift, and the full stop button. So I'll hold down Alt, Shift, and full stop to increase the code slightly more. So now that the code is visible, we can start scripting. Now, the first piece of code we are going to write over here is just a generic function. And the idea is to show you how to create a function and how a lambda function varies from the default way of creating a function. So I'll simply call define give this function a name called greeting. I'll provide this function with a parameter called x. Also, remember we are working in Python, so colons are extremely important. Then I want to indent and return some sort of value. In this case, I'm simply going to return x. On a new line, I have to invoke or call this function. So I'll simply do that by calling print. And inside of my print method over here, I'll call the function by invoking it, greeting, and I'll supply it with the parameter hello world. Now, if we run this code, the output we should get is simply just a string of hello world. So let's run our code, and we can see at the bottom, everything works out just fine. Great. So how can we repeat the creation of this function, but instead of using a normal default function, the idea is to use a Lambda function, otherwise known as an anonymous function. So I'll block out this code over here by commenting it out. On a new line, I'll call x a variable. I'll assign Lambda to this. Remember, with Lambda functions, we start by specifying the Lambda keyword. I'll provide this with a parameter a, colon a, and now I'm simply going to print over here x, open new parentheses, and specify hello world 2, just so that we have some sort of variation of our code. I'll now run this code, and we can see this achieves the exact same thing. If we wanted to be a bit more consistent, we can remove the 2 over here, run the code again, and we have hello world. So in essence, we've achieved the same thing with the Lambda function, much like we did with a default and generic function over here. I would argue one of the useful things about Lambda functions, apart from being anonymous and easy to create, is that it also allows you to make your code a bit more lean. So what exactly have we done over here? We've created a variable x. We've set that equal to a Lambda function, which takes in a parameter and then spits out some sort of expression, all in one line over here, which I think is a pretty neat way of creating functions in Python. Now let's try another example of a default way of writing functions and comparing that to the use of a Lambda function. I'll erase the code over here, and I'm going to create a new function called multiplication, and that's it. I'll then allow this function to take in two parameters, x as well as y, set my colon for indentation, and then I'm simply going to return x multiplied by y. Lastly, I'll print this out on a new line over here, just to say multiplication. I'll pass in 2 as the x parameter, as well as 5 for the y parameter. So now if we print this, we should receive a result of 10. So let's recreate this function once again using a Lambda function. I'll comment this out. On a new line, I'll set a variable z equal to Lambda. I'll provide two parameters here once again, x as well as y. The expression will then return x multiplied by y. And then on a new line, I will perform a print again. That is to say, print z in my parentheses. I'll call the two parameters x and y into my function over here. And if I run this now, I receive 10 as well. Once again, you could make the argument that writing Lambda functions and reading Lambda functions tends to be slightly easier when compared to the default way of writing functions. So with the next block of code, let's try something a little more complex. I'm going to erase the base code over here. And before we start writing any code, what I'm going to essentially try to achieve is to mix both a default function as well as a Lambda function all in one go. The idea here is to write the function as per usual, but return a Lambda function as the result. And this is going to be very similar to the previous example, but this might seem slightly more complex. So I'll begin by defining our function. I'll call this multiplication underscore Lambda. And I'm simply going to pass in a parameter over here, which is going to be n in this case. And then I'll call in my colon. On a new line, I'll simply return. But instead of just returning n, I'm going to return a Lambda function. So bear with me for a second. So I'll call Lambda. I'll pass in one parameter a, and the expression here is going to be a multiplied by n. Remember, n in this case is the n parameter we passed in with our default function creation, whereas a is the parameter associated with our lambda function. On a new line over here, I'll set x equal to the multiplication lambda, and then I'll pass in 2 as the n variable, and then I'll simply print this out as x, open my parentheses, pass in 5 over here, and then I'll print this out. We should get 10 as well. So what exactly is happening over here? We've created a default function. We then return a lambda function, which takes in the a parameter of that lambda function and also multiplies that a value or that a parameter with the n parameter from our default function. We then set our function equal to a variable x. We supply it with a parameter of 2 to supplement the n value over here. We then print x, which holds our multiplication lambda. We then pass in the number 5 as our a parameter over here, and that provides us with an integer of 10 as a result. Wonderful. Now let's do one last example. I'm simply going to remove this code over here, and the next example is going to allow us to create some sort of list and filter function so that we can filter through a list of numbers and only extract and print the numbers that are even numbers. To do this, I'm going to create a number list. I'm going to provide 12 integers inside of this list. So we have a variable called number underscore list, which is equal to a list of 1 up until 12 as the integers stored within this list. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to call the filter function over here, and I'm going to pass in a lambda with a parameter called number, and then I'm going to return the expression number modulus, which is one of the operators we worked with before, and I'll set this equal to 2 is equal to 0. In this case, we only want the even numbers, so numbers such as 2 or 4 divided by 2 will always return a 0 remainder. Great. I'll then pass in a second parameter as part of my filter function, because my filter function requires the first parameter, which is this lambda over here, and then a second parameter, which is going to be my number list. I'll then create variable x. I'll set this equal to the list function. And inside of this list function over here, I'll simply just grab this line of code, cut this out, paste this in over here. And that is simply because we don't want to repeat this step. The idea is to assign this function to variable x so that we can eventually print that out. So now with our understanding that we are using a lambda and the modulus operator to filter through our list of numbers and only print out the even numbers, we can simply head on over a new line over here, print x, and let's clean up our code slightly. And if I now run this, we should have an output of a list which only retrieves the even numbers within our given list. And that brings us to the end of our very first lesson in Module 2 of Python programming. In today's lesson, we learned about the importance of lambda functions and how they vary from default functions, and how we can also combine the two for computation. In our next lesson, we're going to focus on exception handling, and we'll learn how to handle errors inside of Python. So for all of that and more, I'll see you in the next lesson. Cheers.